In 1969, amidst the Cold War, astronaut Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon. With this achievement, the United States won the aerospace race against the Soviet Union and further solidified its global hegemony. But is this really true? Many people believe this event never happened and that all evidence is forged. Hello, I'm Eva Lema, and I'll be with you once again here on the Unknown Facts channel. Today I'll talk about the moon landing, its context, and of course the conspiracy theories that often overshadow the event. Let's delve into history. In the 1960s, the world was gripped by what we know as the Cold War. At that time, the United States and the Soviet Union battled for global harmony, disputing influence in other countries, clashing over their ideologies, and relentlessly racing to see who had the greater military and technological advancement. Then, the focus of both nations turned to space. Whoever reached space first or most effectively would win the space race and consequently gain an advantage in global hegemony. Well, the Soviet Union took the lead. Yuri Gagarin, a Russian cosmonaut, became the first man in space. The United States certainly felt the impact of this Soviet achievement and, therefore, began investing heavily in its own space program. President John F. Kennedy declared that, to surpass the Soviet Union, he wanted a man on the moon before the end of the decade. The focus on this goal was so immense that the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, had a virtually unlimited budget at the time. From then on, the United States achieved astonishing scientific advancements, especially in microelectronics. These advancements enabled the miniaturization of the electronic equipment necessary for the Apollo missions. It's no coincidence that companies like Microsoft, Apple, Google, and others are based in the United States. In July 1969, the momentous day finally arrived. 3 American astronauts embarked on a journey to the moon. Neil Armstrong stepped onto our satellite and uttered the famous phrase, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." Today, the United States practically won the aerospace race against the Soviet Union, which began to decline. Throughout human history, only 12 men have had the privilege of walking on the moon's surface. In total, 24 astronauts have been in lunar orbit, all members of the 6 Apollo missions executed between the 1960s and 1970s. For context, there are cinematographic records from the Apollo 11 mission's liftoff to its return, and over 15,000 publicly available photos released by NASA about the events. When we talk about conspiracy theories, the consensus usually involves the images and recordings made by the Apollo crew, suggesting they were forged, altered, or even staged. Was it a hoax for the United States to deceive the Soviet Union and, consequently, the entire world, thereby generating immense propaganda for themselves? The problem is that even if we disregard the images and recordings of that moon landing, there is extensive other evidence that humans have indeed been there. The main proofs are 3. First, over 380 kegon of lunar rocks have been brought back and studied for decades. Second, it's possible to reflect laser beams launched from Earth off reflector mirrors placed on the moon by astronauts. Additionally, images of the landing sites have been captured by NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. Let's delve into these explanations in more detail. On the moon, there is no atmosphere like on Earth. This means a footprint on the satellite's surface would not be affected by constant atmospheric weathering, and thus traces could remain visible for a very long time after being made. Thanks to current equipment, it is indeed possible to see these marks. The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, LRO, launched by NASA in 2009, is a robotic spacecraft that orbits the moon at an average distance of about 73 kilometers from its surface. It produces high-quality photos capable not only of showing the footprints, but also of identifying mineral resources. Some photos even show various objects and materials left by humans on the lunar surface, including the Eagle lunar module, a retroreflector, a seismometer, and even a Hasselblad camera. Of course, it's also possible to see the marks left by the first spacecraft landing on the moon. A humorous point is that despite many claiming the 1969 moon landing images were doctored and forged, most image and video falsification technologies didn't even exist then. Photoshop, for example, was only released in the 1990s. At the time the Apollo mission images and videos were released, common computers capable of analyzing the trajectory of dust particles ejected from the moon's surface by astronauts or lunar vehicles did not exist. Today, analyzing the old recordings, it's possible to observe that the trajectory of these particles is parabolic. This means they reacted as if they were in a vacuum, free of dissipative forces like air friction. Basically, the particles reacted as if they were in space, not on Earth. Would it have been possible to reproduce this on Earth? It would be extremely difficult. It would require a vacuum chamber larger than any that existed at that time. We're talking about the 1960s. Additionally, with current computers, it's possible to calculate the force of gravity exerted on these dust particles on the moon's surface. The calculations yield exactly the expected amount for the satellite, about 1.62 meters per second squared. Today, we could create such a video with computer graphics, but in 1969 it was impossible. Remember I mentioned reflector mirrors? They were installed by astronauts from Apollo missions 11, 14, and 15, and are capable of reflecting light back to the emitting source with high precision. These beams, emitted from various locations around the planet, allow us to precisely measure the distance from Earth to the moon. Such reflection would be impossible if humans had not landed on the lunar surface and placed these reflectors. This is irrefutable evidence confirming Neil Armstrong's landing on the moon. The last plausible argument verifying human landings on the moon is the immense quantity of material brought back from the moon. As mentioned before, over 380 kiloliters of lunar content was returned. Among these samples, scientists found rocks produced under specific lunar conditions distinctly different from those found on Earth. Surprisingly, one rock found on the moon appeared to scientists to have been formed from compositions present on planet Earth. This reinforced the astronomical theory that the moon possibly formed after a collision between Earth and an enormous asteroid billions of years ago. If all this isn't enough, NASA itself invites those who doubt its information to contact the more than 400,000 people involved in the missions. Furthermore, beyond the Americans themselves, evidence can also be verified by their adversaries at the time, the Soviets. These documents must exist in Russia. Obviously, the Soviets closely observed the event, often in secret. When the landing happened, the Soviet Union acknowledged it and strongly felt the consequences of being defeated in the aerospace race. If it had all been a hoax, the KGB and the Soviet Union would have been the first to discover it and would undoubtedly have exposed everything in the 1970s to maintain their position in the Cold War. Theories about never having reached the moon gained traction notably with Bill Kaysing's self-published book in 1976, titled We Never Went to the Moon. Kaysing was a former employee of Rocketdyne, a company that helped build part of the Saturn V rocket. He claimed to have had access to top-secret NASA documents asserting there was only a 0.01% chance of success for a moon landing. The document was real, but how NASA arrived at such a specific number? Let's just say these are questions Bill himself probably doesn't know today. It was because of him that many theories persist to this day, alleging that humans never reached the moon. Generally, these theories ignore much of the concrete evidence and proofs that humans have landed on the moon. Still, there is much to research there. Humans have had many opportunities to step on lunar soil. Theories about what we can find on our natural satellite and why we don't send astronauts there frequently, these are questions for another video. So, if you still don't believe NASA's story, comment below your main argument. Which of these arguments, for you, is the most irrefutable certainty? Thank you very much for your company here. A big hug, and stay with God, and see you next time.